Welcome. This is a lecture series. Please have paper and pencils ready to take notes. The more detailed your notes, the better it will be for you to be able to use your notes later on when you have an assignment. Let's get started. Today we're going to talk about standard 8.3.R.7 in the state of Oklahoma. That's for 8th grade, the third standard for reading point 7. The language of this standard reads, students will make connections using, for example, thematic links and literary analysis between and across multiple texts and provide textual evidence to support their inferences. Please pause the video and write down the language of this standard. Infer. Let's talk about inference. To infer means to form an opinion from available facts. After you read a couple of different texts or passages, you're going to form an opinion on what those passages are about and how they are different or alike, and you're going to make an inference. Then you're going to use evidence from those texts to support that inference. Please pause the video to write down the definition of infer. Now let's talk about analyzation. Becoming a person who reads text and analyzes it is a very important part of your critical reading skills. It is very important as you continue on from these grades forward to have critical reading skills. Analyzing a text and making text-to-text connections means that you are becoming a better reader. You will be able to identify elements that are the same and that are different. Then you're going to use those elements to analyze how the texts are the same and how they are different. So analyzation and the definition are on this page. Please pause the video and write down the definition. Your teacher may give you an example of this Venn diagram here. They have different types of graphic organizers that you can use to make connections between text. I like the Venn diagram because it's simple. If I read two separate passages, I can draw a Venn diagram, which is two circles where the centers interconnect, and I can write down my information between my text. So how would I use a Venn diagram, say if I read two passages, one about cats and one about dogs? They would help me to make connections between the text. So see in the red, I read passage A about cats, and I wrote down some connections here that I made to the text. Cats hate water, cats are snooty, cats like to be awake at night. Then I read passage B, and it was about dogs. Dogs love the water, dogs are friendly, and dogs like to sleep a lot. Then I found what was made a connection of those two texts. See what's in the center there of where the blue and the red circles intersect? Both cats and dogs make good house pets. Both cats and dogs make you feel better. So I found a connection between the text about dogs and cats. Now, you and I both know that these statements are not completely true about every single cat or every single dog. But that was the passages that I read. That's the statements that the authors made, and I found a connection. So I could take that connection and I could make a statement from those connections. So this is an example of a Venn diagram and how to use a Venn diagram to make connections between two texts that may not appear to be related. Now let's talk about strategies for connecting text. When we connect text, we find the relationships between them. Like with our example with cats and dogs, you may think they're completely different, but we found how cats and dogs can be the same. You're using kind of like a compare and contrasting method to see how they're alike and different. Look for ideas of how each text connects. In our example of the cats and the dogs, we found out that they're both good pets. We found out that they both make you feel better. Then look for how the themes, the overall theme of the text would connect. That's called the thematic link. And I think in my passage where I read about cats and dogs, the overall theme was that they both make good pets. Please pause this video and write down the definitions and strategies for connecting text. So how can you make connections within an author's work? There is the method of author analysis. You can look at something that a single author has written. For instance, if they wrote 2 books, like John Steinbeck. He wrote The Grapes of Wrath and he wrote Of Mice and Men. So I could compare the themes in both of those books to see if they are alike or different. And I could ask myself, did he use the same theme over and over in different pieces of literature? Do they keep the same writing style, or did they stay in the same genre? So that's called an author analysis. The main goal here we have of making those connections is that we want to look at the different ways that authors approach their writing. For example, sometimes a writer, like Shakespeare, may write on a certain subject early in their life and be favorable toward it, and then toward the end of their life, after they've had a lot of life experiences, their tone or attitude changes in the way that they write about a subject. So we can make text-to-text connections that explore different ways that they approach their writings. And it goes deeper than just the obvious details. Like I just spoke about, the time that an author lives in matters. For example, if an author wrote a book when they were very young and they had not experienced much in life, and then they wrote a book later in life, say after some great major catastrophe happened in their life, like a war, then their viewpoint may change. That's going to be beyond the obvious details that are in the actual text. If you study the author and you find out about the author, find out what sex they are, what their gender is, what age they are when they wrote a particular piece. Find out about their background, their race, their culture, were they married, were they come from a family, were they orphaned, were they rich, were they poor, what was their culture that they grew up in. And then we can look at their work a little closer and we can see patterns perhaps. So this is making an author analysis and digging into what's behind more than just the story. Please pause the video now to write down any relevant information you see on this slide for an author's analysis. Now, how do we make connections in 2 completely separate texts from 2 completely separate writers? We can look for thematic connections like we talked about earlier. For example, we can take 2 books that are on completely different subject matters and we can find a similar theme. I chose to look at 2 books here. First, the novel, The House on Mango Street. This book was a theme that was about a young woman who is struggling to define herself. Then let's look at another book called A Framework for Understanding Poverty by Ruby Payne. In The House on Mango Street, the young woman was in a poverty situation. So Mango Street is a work of fiction, and Framework is a nonfiction book for educational purposes. So let's think about this. If we read this nonfiction book, A Framework for Understanding Poverty, and it gave us a better understanding of what it was like for somebody who lives in an impoverished neighborhood or situation, would that change the way you look at the book, The House on Mango Street? It would. They have very different subject matters, but they have a similar theme of poverty in a young person's life. So even though they are completely separate texts and seemingly 2 completely separate ideas, they actually have a connection. Please pause the video and write down any information that you feel is important on this slide. So if you're trying to make connections on other levels between 2 texts, you can look at characters, settings, plots. You can look at the major events in the text, and you can even keep in mind that all different kinds of genres can share similar themes. You can even compare fact with fictions. Please pause the video and write down the ideas here for making connections on other levels between text. Now you want to show what you know. Now that you've gathered your thoughts, you need to make your inference. Remember what we said about inference? It's where you develop that idea or opinion, and then you use your evidence from the text to support what your opinion is about those two particular complex texts. Whenever I said that I came across the similar idea that cats and dogs both make good pets and they both make you feel good, I would use evidence from my text to show that I believe both cats and dogs are good pets. So you remember what inference means, right? It means to use the textual evidence to prove or back up your main statement or conclusion that you've made about the connection. Let's look at our standard one more time. So the language of this standard was saying that you're going to make connections between or across multiple texts and provide textual evidence to support your inferences. So you're going to make connections. You're going to look at things such as thematic links, and you're going to use literary analysis between more than one text, like two passages. And then you're going to use evidence from those passages to support what your opinion is or the connections that you found. If you are doing an OCCT test for the state of Oklahoma, you would have two passages that you would be reading. You would make connections between those two texts. You would find those connections like a thematic link or using different literary elements to decide how those texts were alike. Then you would make an inference, or you would give an opinion about those connections. Then you would use evidence that you have gained from those two passages. You might say, in line number 20, I read blank, blank, blank. So that is how you would use evidence. So the language here is about you making connections with different texts, and you're using evidence to support your opinion. Make sure you keep your notes handy, and whenever you're practicing these skills with your assignments, with your parent or your teacher, and then take an assessment to ensure mastery of this skill. Thank you for joining me today.